Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. If you've ever found yourself wondering how we actually learn or why some minds process things so differently from others, well, you are absolutely in the right place. Okay, let's dive into this. Our big goal today is to completely demystify learning disabilities and ADHD. We're going to look straight at the source data to separate fact from fiction. By the end of this, you're going to have a crystal clear picture of what these conditions literally are, both biologically and practically.
So here's our roadmap. First, we'll cover common learning disabilities, then we'll define exactly what ADHD is. From there, we'll unpack the characteristics of ADHD, and finally, we'll wrap up with some really practical classroom strategies. It's essentially a zoom-in arc, going from broad definitions straight down into a deep dive of highly actionable tips.
All right, Part 1, Common Learning Disabilities. Setting up a solid baseline vocabulary here is absolutely crucial for everything else we're going to talk about today.
First up, we have dyslexia. Now, at its core, this is a language-based learning disability. It shows up as a severe impairment in a person's ability to read and spell. And what's kind of wild is that this isn't a new concept at all. The term was actually coined way back in 1887 by a doctor named Rudolf Berlin. So for a dyslexic child, you've got to remember the hurdle isn't intelligence, not at all. It's just a very specific friction with language skills. Next on our list is dysgraphia. Think of this as a writing disorder. It essentially manifests as a real deficiency in the physical ability to write. So we're talking struggles with spelling, handwriting, and just getting thoughts out onto paper. But here is the absolute key distinction. Dysgraphia is totally independent of how well a student can read, and it is absolutely not caused by an intellectual impairment. You could literally have a brilliant student who reads perfectly, but hits a massive invisible wall the second they're asked to write something down. Then we have dyscalculia. As you might guess from the name, this is an innate difficulty specifically with calculations and math. The defining metric here is that a person's mathematical ability falls way, way below what you'd expect for someone of their age and intelligence level. Rounding out our broad definitions, there's dyspraxia. Now, this one is a motor activity disorder. In this scenario, the learning difficulties actually stem from a child not being able to coordinate their body movements effectively. They just have a really tough time manipulating physical objects. To put that into a relatable perspective, our source notes that these kids might struggle with everyday things like holding a pencil properly, buttoning up a shirt, or even just tying their shoelaces.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the contrast. When you put these conditions side by side, a super clear distinction emerges. You've got language and reading disorders like dyslexia and dysgraphia, which are all about the cognitive processing of symbols and text. But then, on the flip side, you have motor activity disorders like dyspraxia, which is purely about physical movement coordination. Recognizing this difference, it's literally step one in figuring out how to actually help a student. I mean, you obviously wouldn't treat a physical coordination issue the exact same way you'd tackle a language processing hurdle, right?
Moving right along, let's jump into Section 2, Defining ADHD. We're zooming in from the broad landscape of disabilities to focus on the specific neurobiological reality of ADHD. So what exactly is ADHD? Well, our source defines it as a developmental neurobiological disability. And I really want to emphasize that word neurobiological. It completely reframes ADHD. This isn't some behavioral choice or the result of bad parenting. It's a biological reality that directly affects how a person pays attention. Plus, the data shows it has very strong genetic contributions. It is hardwired into the brain. And honestly, it's incredibly common. ADHD is actually the most frequently diagnosed behavioral disorder in childhood. It affects anywhere from 5 to 7% of school-aged kids. To put that into perspective, if you picture a standard classroom, that statistic basically guarantees that every single teacher is going to have students with ADHD in their room. It's a huge slice of the student population.
But how it shows up across different demographics, that is striking. The condition is diagnosed 4 to 9 times more often in boys than in girls. Let that sink in for a second. That is a massive gender disparity in diagnosis rates, and it's a huge data point for educators and researchers trying to track how this condition actually presents in the real world.
All right, let's keep zooming in. Section 3, Characteristics of ADHD. Let's look under the hood at the inner workings of an ADHD mind to really build some empathy here. And this brilliantly illustrates the 3 core pillars of ADHD: inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. Under inattention, you've got traits like being highly distractible, dealing with low working memory, and struggling to follow instructions. Then, under hyperactivity, it's all about excessive physical movement. Fidgeting, squirming, having a really hard time staying seated, and doing things completely unrelated to the task at hand. Finally, impulsivity. That shows up as impaired response inhibition, a super low tolerance for frustration, and a really tough time delaying gratification. When you see it laid out like a giant puzzle like this, you really start to understand just how overwhelming it must be for the kids experiencing it.
Drilling down a bit deeper, we find that children with ADHD face major hurdles when it comes to regulating their emotions, their motivation, and their arousal levels. This explains why you'll so often see them bouncing from one unfinished activity to another. It's not that they don't want to finish what they started. It's just that their neurological wiring makes sustaining that focus incredibly draining. The impulsive behavior we see isn't them being defiant. It's simply a symptom of a neurobiological engine that's really struggling to hit the brakes.
Okay, bringing us to the final and maybe most important part of our explainer today. Section 4, Classroom Strategies for ADHD. Let's pivot entirely to actionable, evidence-based solutions.
So the crucial point is how we actually structure the workload for these students. Here are 3 super practical steps a teacher can implement right away. Step 1, give them just one assignment at a time. Don't throw the whole shebang at them at once. Step 2, break longer presentations down into discrete, bite-sized segments to minimize distractions. And Step 3, provide extended time for exams and for finishing assignments. By tweaking the workload to actually match their attention span, you're setting the student up for a win rather than a failure.
Now, beyond just the assignments, we've got to look at the physical environment. The source strongly recommends special seating arrangements to cut down on visual and auditory distractions. For assessments, letting the child test in a quiet, secluded area is a total game changer. But perhaps most importantly, we need to eliminate or at least heavily reduce timed tests. Doing that drastically slashes testing anxiety. And generally speaking, placing these students in classes with a low pupil-to-teacher ratio makes a huge difference for their learning.
I actually want to pause for a second on this next strategy because I think it is just absolutely wonderful. The text suggests creating a secret signal with the student, something only the two of you know, to use as a gentle reminder when they drift off task. How great is that? Instead of calling a kid out in front of everyone and causing embarrassment, the teacher and student share this compassionate private connection. It quietly nudges their neurobiology back on track without stripping away their dignity. Let's bring it all home with our final set of strategies, instructional supports. The research points toward using direct instruction and programmed learning with really clear, structured materials. It's also vital to supplement verbal instructions with visual ones. Incorporating assistive technology, things like computers or projectors, can literally make classroom activities so much more engaging for an ADHD mind. You've also got to set crystal clear expectations and give immediate feedback so they know right away if they're on the right track. Finally, connect with their learning to actual real-life experiences to really anchor the concepts. As we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with one final thought to chew on. We've just gone through some amazing strategies, right? Breaking down tasks, using visual tech, reducing anxiety, and building real connections. But it kind of begs the question, if we adapt our classrooms to perfectly support the neurobiology of an ADHD student, might we actually end up creating a significantly better, more engaging learning environment for all of our students? When we design for neurodiversity, we often end up elevating the entire educational experience for everyone in the room. Thank you so much for hanging out and diving deep with me today. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.